Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, discuss the art and the science of the stuff that we're putting on our feet. I'm Andrea Myers, and today we have a special guest with us today. We've got Tina Danforth, who is a Brooks footwear product line manager. Welcome, Tina. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Long-time listener, obviously first time on the pod with Brooks. So excited to be with you guys and specifically talk to you.
Yeah, I am super excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the Brooks Hyperion Max, but we'll get to that in a second. But maybe you could tell our listeners just a little bit about your history in the footwear industry, your running. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, of course. So high school track athlete, 300-meter hurdles was my event. So very much near and dear to my heart there. Obviously more of like a sprinter than a distance runner. So once I graduated from college, I started working at a running store. And that kind of, began my love for more, I guess, long distance training after that, because, anything over 400 was just like madness to me, definitely. Did not enjoy it. And so started training at Marathon Sports in Boston, which is where I'm from. And so from there, got a tech rep job in the industry and kind of made my way throughout a couple of different companies, and honestly always loved product, always had an interest in it, from top to bottom, like, how geometries worked, how stack heights were important, even the textiles that we use, like per shoe, to me always interest me. So things like that really got me going into the product space. And as far as my running history, I've run a few half marathons. I've run Boston Marathon. That was my check.
Awesome.
Definitely a hurt locker going into that race. But if you've ever run it, obviously, it's just like the most wonderful time of the year. It's, from start to finish, everyone's cheering for you. And there's no better race to do for your first and your last marathon. So was super, super privileged to be able to do that. And now working on running product for Brooks. So, couldn't be more grateful to be in this industry and obviously working on product every day.
That's awesome. And as a fellow 300-meter hurdler, I wholeheartedly agree that 1 to 2 laps of the track was definitely enough for me when I was younger. Now I've expanded to longer, but 300 hurdles is definitely the best event, isn't it?
Agreed. It's so interesting to me how regionally it can be 400 or 300, but in Massachusetts, we always had 300, which I was grateful for because that extra 100, I think probably would have killed me. So,
oh yeah. I ran in Illinois and same, it was 300, but whenever I did USATF junior races, it was 400 and it was like, oh gosh, this extra 100 is just brutal.
Yeah. Whenever our meets would come down to the 4x4 and my coach was like, hey, I need to put you in. I was like, oh, I know this is going to be painful. But anyways, it's good learning for sure.
Absolutely. So today, Tina is joining us to talk about all of the updates to the Hyperion line. We're going to talk a little bit about Ghost Max 2 and just where Brooks is headed with their design for 2025 and beyond. But of course, first, we're going to start out talking about one of my favorite topics, which is the Brooks Hyperion Max, which has definitely been my favorite shoe since you guys sent it to me last year. So can you tell us just about the evolution in the Hyperion line over the past few years, and specifically what led to the changes you made in the Hyperion Max 2 and Hyperion 2?
Yeah, of course. So it's kind of been an interesting evolution because when you look at kind of the consumer segment and just the market in general, it's one of the fastest evolving lines because, again, you always want that next advantage and that next advantage. So when we were looking at Hyperion Max 1, we had DNA Flash V1, which we had in Hyperion Tempo. And that was our first, how can we get a biggest advantage into an everyday foam? And so that was kind of how that first came to life. And so Hyperion Max 1 was really this shoe that was made for everyday training, but to give you, a quicker turnover, definitely a faster transition, and really kind of putting that advantage into kind of a train to race product. So that was really important kind of going into that. And then as we saw it evolve, we really looked at kind of our line architecture in different ways. So we had, two kind of segmented line strategies. One was like speed, and then one was energized. And so there were shoes called the Levitate, which you might know, that kind of fit in that energized bucket. And then we used DNA Amp to kind of represent that. Once we launched Hyperion Max 1, we saw that those really started to merge. So the same consumers, the way they talked about the Levitate and DNA Amp as far as like what they wanted out of that technology, they were saying the exact same things out of Hyperion Max 1 and DNA Flash V1. So we kind of took that strategy and that insight and we said, okay, how can we start to merge these and make this like super light, super responsive, very resilient foam that was just kind of fun for everybody to run in.
So we ask this of pretty much every shoe company we talk to, but can you explain the differences between your foams, DNA Flash, DNA Amp, DNA Loft? For Hyperion 2 and Hyperion Max 2, you're on DNA Flash version 2, right? But then in Ghost Max 2, you're on DNA Loft version 3, if I'm correct. So could you just help us understand the differences in properties between the foams?
Yeah, for sure. So when we looked at Loft versus Flash, basically resiliency was important for both of them, but kind of the bounce back rates were where we really started to kind of segment them more. So obviously they're both supercritical foam when you looked at Loft V3 and you look at Flash V1 and Flash V2. But really in order to get like that responsiveness, we wanted basically that foam to deform and then bounce back super quickly. Now, when you get to kind of your Loft foam, we want it to basically kind of deform a little bit more, and then it would still bounce back. But we want you to kind of spend more time sinking into that because that consumer just sees that as a more comfortable experience. So that's where we get into these kind of small cell versus large cell iterations. So in all of the Loft product, you'll see that large cell. So again, it just gives you a little bit more time to deform and kind of give you help you spend a little bit more time in that comfort zone before it bounces back. Versus Flash, it's a small cell iteration, and that basically allows you to kind of hit it and then jump back as soon as you can. So again, we can kind of use geometries to exacerbate any of those foams. We can certainly carve a lot into Flash V2 and make it feel soft, but really it's kind of that bounce back of what that product does and then what that consumer expects out of that product. So basically a softness versus like a bounciness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely experience what you're describing in that Flash, both V1 and V2, has some compliance, but a lot more resilience compared to Loft. And Loft, yeah, you definitely get that sinking in feeling and not as much bounce back or resilience that you feel in Loft. So in your tech sheets, you say for Hyperion Max 2 and Hyperion 2, DNA Flash V2 has 10% more resilience. Can you tell us a little bit about how you manipulated DNA Flash 2 to give it that additional resilience property?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So basically, going from Flash V1 to Flash V2, we added a material called TPEE, and so basically, it was more of a blend where instead of an EVA blend, it's an EVA and a TPEE blend. And what that does for us is really kind of allows it to be a little bit softer overall, even for a responsive foam. But the bounce back properties are unbelievable. So again, when we were seeing this merge of like energized to speed, people were still looking for kind of that bounce back and that resiliency, but they didn't want it to feel like super flat. They didn't want it to feel like they were feeling the ground more. They still wanted at least like a little bit of protection in there. And so adding that blend allowed us to really almost add like a softness to a material that is like super responsive. And so that, obviously started in Hyperion Elite. That was something that we found that was a good unlock from our athletes, over a longer period of time, at least having a little bit more comfort and then bounce back. And then how we took that and really brought it down to Hyperion Max 2 and Hyperion 2. So really that was kind of the big unlock for us, is just adding like almost a comfortability to a responsive product when you just assume that, something like that you want to keep as firm as possible. We were looking at a balance between the two.
Interesting. And now does the addition of the you said TPEE,
Yep.
That's the new blend. How did that change the weight of the foam?
Yeah, so it actually allowed it to get lighter in general.
Hmm.
So using that, we could use the same amount and basically cut down the weight from a Flash V1 product versus a Flash V2 product. So that was definitely the start. But really, like I said, it's kind of the overall comfort. So when you step into, if you were to take just like a puck for puck situation, Flash V1 versus Flash V2, same amount of millimeters, same amount of material, like you would just feel just a little bit more of like a comfortable step in versus Flash V1. It is definitely more of a rapid turnover. So we still use it in products that kind of make sense. But Flash V2 for the masses definitely had more appeal to it.
Makes sense. And then we also saw some changes in geometry, specifically stack height, but also a little bit in the rocker profile of Hyperion Max 2 as compared to 1. Can you talk a little bit about the design process through that and what you were intending to change between last year's version and this year's version of the Max?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like anything we do, it starts with consumer insights for us. So, if you take a adrenaline consumer and you ask them like, "What is support?" They'll point to the arch or they'll point to a piece that basically looks like it's a rigid structure. But when you talk about support in a Hyperion consumer or someone who wants more of a responsive cushion shoe, they talk about stack height and foam as support. And so we knew that going from Hyperion Max 1 to Hyperion Max 2, that if we were going to give them support and longevity, that we were going to have to increase the stack height. So, going from 1 to 2, we increased it 4 millimeters, like right from the beginning. And then knowing we were going from Flash V1 to Flash V2, we had to make sure we kind of complemented the geometries to make sure it didn't feel too soft because we wanted to make sure that turnover could happen quickly in that shoe. That's a tough thing when you go, additional 4 millimeters in stack height. You assume like, oh, you want that soft, squishy feel. Well, if you're turning over quickly, obviously you want to make sure that you build in that stable platform to kind of complement that. So that was a huge update for us. And then obviously making sure that the plate complemented that and stabilized the foam as well. Because Flash V2 inherently is just a little bit softer than Flash V1. Again, winding that base, putting in that plate to make sure that you had that quick turnover from heel to toe, but then, that resiliency that you expect in that foam.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree that the additional stack height in V2 plus the plate has made V2 feel more supportive / stable neutral. There's much less ground feel in V2, but not in a bad way. You just feel like your foot is a little more protected from the ground. The foam feels on the firmer side to me, which I like. I don't really like soft shoes. And it just feels well designed for eating up easy miles, tempo runs. I don't really find V2 to be as good for like 10K or faster paces as I did V1. But then, like I said in the review that I wrote, that's on Doctors of Running, Hyperion 2 has really kind of filled up that void for me. I want to talk about Hyperion 2 in a minute because it's a lot different than Hyperion 1. But when your team designed Hyperion Max 2, did you envision that it would be more for like middle to slower paces, or did you think that it would also be useful for, say, speed work?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think like when we started off looking at that season and what we wanted to achieve in 2024, we actually like started with Hyperion Elite 4 in the spring, and basically through kind of some of those elite insights came up with the story of supernatural speed. And so what happened there is like, we would have athletes telling us like they wanted to feel like a superhuman version of themselves, or they wanted to feel like augmented in some way. And then like, the next little soundbite would be like, oh, but I want it to feel like natural and an extension of my foot. And we're like, okay, those are two different things, but like, let's work through that and kind of see what that means. And so that started with, like Josh and Nia and CJ and some of our athletes. And then we understood that parts of those will kind of get taken down into our product. So we took it from like a supernatural level and then we made it more natural kind of as we like went down the product line. And so Hyperion Max kind of fit in that spot for us as far as like a train to race shoe. So we wanted to give you the biggest advantage, but we knew with like the stable platform and the way that Flash V2 operates that we could still hit a bigger variety of people instead of just kind of segmenting it as this like everyday tempo shoe. So we really tried to find a balance there, but it is certainly closer to kind of the Elite than it is the Hyperion 2.
Yeah, definitely. And, unfortunately, I have never gotten to test any of the Hyperion Elites, so I can't speak to like my personal experience about it.
Who do I have to talk to after
I don't
this
know.
call?
Seriously. Send them over.
You got it.
But can you maybe describe for our listeners the design process for Hyperion Elite 4, how it's evolved over the years? Is the foam in Elite 4 also DNA Flash 2, or is it a different foam blend?
Yeah, so that foam blend, really kind of that technology roadmap started with Hyperion Elite. So it was like, how can we give that next kind of big advantage? And so Flash V2 was born out of that. And so obviously the first product it goes into is our pinnacle product, our best product, and that was Hyperion Elite 4. But the one thing I kind of want to, definitely signal out for that shoe is the plate that we did. So, there's a lot of iterations of carbon fiber, carbon infused. You can do P-backs, nylon, TPUs. Like there's obviously a lot of different plate iterations. But we partner with a company called Eris. And what they were able to do for us in the Hyperion Elite specifically is basically tune per size. So the same plate thickness that, Des wears for her marathon is not the same plate thickness that CJ Albertson does. And so that was kind of a big unlock for us is like, Des can't put, at 100 pounds, can't put the same amount of force on that plate that CJ can. So if we're able to basically take that information and kind of, create the plate that's best for her body type versus a size, say 11 and a half, we can actually give a better advantage to that athlete per size. And so that's kind of where Eris and the Hyperion Elite started to really work in cohesion. We have this new foam that is amazing, but then how do we look at the shoe as a system, every single piece of that pie, and really make the biggest advantage we can? And obviously doing it per size was one that we looked at, which was fantastic.
Oh, that's really interesting. So are you saying the plates are weight tuned based on size, or they're size tuned based on like foot length?
So based on like thickness. So for instance, we can get like, obviously a size 6 when you look at the amount of foam that we use or the sizing. We are basically taking it and doing at a certain thickness, and then we can get a little bit thicker as we go up in size where that person is putting a lot more force on it. So really it's kind of like plate thickness is where we're able to kind of tune per size.
Okay, so you're making an assumption that like someone who wears a size 7 shoe is probably going to weigh less than someone who wears a size 11.
Correct.
Okay, very interesting. And then do you change the shape of the plate as well for different foot lengths? Or is it just the ratios are the same?
Yeah, it's scaled per size.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily any different there as far as the shape, because we wanted to guide the foot the same way, but yeah, per size, obviously scaled.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So let's move on to Hyperion 2. I was looking at the specs for Hyperion 2 and comparing them to Hyperion Max 1, and they're pretty close. You're only 2 millimeters of stack height off. So I've got maybe 25 miles on my Hyperion 2s right now, and I wouldn't say they feel exactly the same as Hyperion Max 1. There's definitely a noticeable difference in both the heel bevel and the forefoot rocker between the two shoes, but I would say that the stack feels similar and the amount of ground feel feels similar. So was that kind of the intention, is to make Hyperion 2 similar to Hyperion Max 2, or was that not part of the thought process?
Yeah, it actually wasn't part of the thought process. It's kind of where we took Hyperion 1 and we said, okay, what's the first thing we need to do? And kind of going back to our previous conversation where cushioning equals support, we said the first thing we need to do is add 4 millimeters, because we know that the person who's looking to use this every day is going to want just more underfoot. That's how they protect themselves. And so in that, the stack heights obviously get very, very similar. But to your point, it's definitely not an aggressive rocker. If anything, it's definitely a shoe that's meant for kind of heel to toe transition. It's definitely, a little bit smoother overall. It doesn't kind of control the foot as far as an assisted transition like a rocker shoe would. And so really we wanted to build in just like a super fun kind of responsive cushion shoe that could be used as an everyday trainer. When we looked at those speed and energize categories starting to merge, we were like, okay, do we need 2 shoes to do this, or do we need 1 shoe that can really just be your everyday shoe? And that's kind of how the Hyperion 2 was born. So it was kind of like, how can we inject fun in here? And Flash V2 did that for us. But then how can we just make it like an everyday trainer experience to kind of complement the Ghost in a way where the Ghost is more of a balanced approach? Can we take some like exaggerated speed geometries and throw that into that shoe for kind of a fun experience?
Yeah, and I have experienced exactly what you described. I would also say that Hyperion 2 feels like it has more higher longitudinal bending stiffness than Hyperion 1. With Hyperion 1, I enjoyed it, but I just felt like there was a kind of strange flex point a little bit behind my first MTP, which was uncomfortable. And I don't feel that at all in Hyperion 2. And, I've got all the shoes here. You have changed the outsole pattern. Here's Hyperion 2. Here's Hyperion 1. So I wonder if that has also changed where the shoe is able to flex.
Yep.
Can you comment at all on that? Was that intentional? Is that just something weird that I feel?
No, it's definitely intentional. And if you look at it, I'll grab my pair here. Like the more kind of cutouts we have here, the more that foam can kind of displace. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we were looking for overall is like, how can we just provide more comfort from heel to toe? You're going to get the responsiveness. Flash V2 will do that for you. But allowing some of these cutouts, it does, decrease some of the weight. So obviously our weight, is in a very good spot for the shoe, but it allows that foam to kind of displace a little bit more. So you have a little bit more flexibility, but really just an overall kind of comfort in that forefoot that we wanted to put in a shoe that obviously we categorize more as kind of an everyday training shoe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes sense because if you have all of these cutouts, it's going to allow the shoe to flex in a more, basically the whole forefoot can flex depending where you put the force. Whereas here, there's not as many cutouts, so it feels like there's maybe less of an opportunity for it to flex depending on a person's, foot geometry, running mechanics. So yeah, I love both Hyperion 2 and Hyperion Max 2. I'm really enjoying putting miles on both. So I can't credit your team enough for just improving the shoes that I love so much. And one thing that really surprised me with both of these shoes, because I had 0 complaints about Hyperion Max 1. Like, I think I have 4 pairs, and I've gotten over 300 miles on each pair. But you guys really went above and beyond with the upper in Max 2 and Hyperion 2. So what led you to change that from versions 1?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad that you brought this up because like you said, that was one thing that I just loved about the product process was just like when you pick a textile that seems so right, like it really kind of brings the shoe to life from a top to bottom. And so when we looked at these shoes, again, how do we bring a little bit more mass appeal? Like we selected a textile that's basically this double jacquard mesh upper. And what it allows us to do is really bring this kind of depth to design, but add these zones that just add breathability without necessarily feeling like you need to open up the mesh too much and expose it too much. And so that allows us to really make kind of that everyday trainer technology. But it really just had this great hold to it, but it also had this nice flexibility in the forefoot. So all these things we really were trying to build into a shoe that just could fit more people in general. And that was kind of important going into Max 2 and Hyperion 2 is how can we just invite more people into this category? And that's fitting definitely more feet. I mean, even down to the details, I don't know how you feel about the Max 2 tongue, but it's honestly one of my favorite things that we've ever done. It kind of has this nice, locked in, but bounce back property. Mm-hmm. When we were doing wear testing with that, people were like, okay, it's responsive. I feel protected. liking the fit. And then they were like, if you change anything about this shoe, do not change the tongue. The tongue was called out in like every single review. So little things like that can kind of, give someone just like a more comfortable feeling in the shoe, just get people excited about the shoe. And that knit tongue was just kind of like a winner from the beginning, which is cool.
Yeah, and I really love the tongue design. And I would say the only complaint I had about Max 1 was the tongue. You can see I used the little loop on here to lace through to help the tongue stay in place. But even with that, like you can see how the tongue has kind of folded over from where I tie it. Mm-hmm. If you don't lace the laces through the loop here, the tongue definitely would slide to the side for me. And I heard from a lot of our listeners that they had the same experience. So this tongue doesn't move at all. And it holds your foot so comfortably. And there's no pressure. I haven't had the top of the tongue fold up from the laces. And you also improved the laces too with the little ridges. Definitely helps it stay tied better. But yeah, the tongue it gives you that nice midfoot hold. And I felt like there was better midfoot security with version 2 of both Hyperion and Hyperion Max. So will we see this upper in any other shoes that are coming out?
Ooh, good question. We'll probably evolve it, find some ways that we can certainly kind of get those breathable zones, the depth of design detail. Double jacquard meshes aren't going away. It's just kind of how we execute them. I do think people are going to expect more from uppers than ever before because foams are so competitive now. I think your next advantage is like how that upper is executed, how tongues are executed, how heel flares are executed. And so I think those little details are going to matter, more than they ever have before, especially as like more people come into that responsive cushion category. Again, if you look at like the competitor landscape, like there are a lot of shoes that are categorized that way that are in the top 25 at retail. And it used to be just like Ghosts, Glycerins, 2000s, Cumulus, Cliftons. And now you're starting to see these responsive cushion shoes really pop up in that space. So people are realizing they can get kind of these like fun foams for, pretty good packages as far as price goes. And so now when you look at the upper and how they basically wrap the foot and the materials that we use, those are going to be more important than ever. Even like little eye stay details, people are starting to pay attention to.
Well, yeah, and the other thing that we haven't talked about is shoes are getting more expensive. So people want value out of the shoes they're buying. You don't want a shoe that has a fragile lacing system and the eyelet breaks on you 3 runs in. You don't want the outsole to peel off because you're Matt Klein and you destroy the posterior lateral heel. If you're spending $150 to $200 on a pair of shoes, you want it to last.
Yep.
So I would agree with you that people should expect a very well all-around design shoe, not just the foam properties or how it performs, but also comfort and fit. I've been testing a shoe, and I won't say which one, but I love the ride. It is probably my favorite racing shoe I've tested this year, but it has a giant blood stain on the heel because of how badly it ripped up my Achilles. So I can't wear it. I've tried everything to make it not rip up my heel, but I can't get it to stop, so I won't be running it anymore. I'm not the only one who's had that issue. So people want shoes that are comfortable. You don't want to be bleeding afterwards, but you also don't want hot spots on the top of your foot, or you don't want to be able to feel the laces on the dorsum of your ankle. So it's great to hear that your team is really paying attention to all of the little details.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, one of the things I think our biggest win actually is the reviews that we were getting on the Hyperion Elite upper as far as how it fit. Because when you look at shoes in that 250 plus category, again, it's like, how can you give me the biggest advantage? What's the best foam? What's the best plate? Or how can you really shape the plate to give me an advantage? And those are all details that we sweat over as well. But when the reviews came back and said how well it fit, like we were very proud of that moment because again, I've been in those situations where I've done a long run and again, it's ripped up my heel or maybe I got like a blister on top of my toe. And those are things that you just don't want to think about. You're thinking about a million other things. And so when you have an upper that's meant to give you an advantage with the platform, like that was honestly one of kind of the proudest moments that we had with that shoe.
That's awesome. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about the changes in the geometry of these two shoes, particularly Hyperion Max 2, is Hyperion Max 1 had some stable neutral features, but I really feel like Hyperion Max 2 is like a very solidly stable neutral shoe. And you've really, I would say, expanded the sole flaring, the rocker geometry. The plate definitely adds some stability, but one of the things I really like about Hyperion Max 2 is you made the sole flare in the forefoot significantly wider on the lateral side. And for people like myself who have trouble loading my big toe or first MTP joint, this plays a huge role in just helping me push off much more smoothly than I would in a shoe that doesn't have this design. Again, was that intentional? Because this isn't a feature you see in a lot of shoes. Often companies are trying to help people, load medially more slowly or less. So can you comment on that, what the design idea was behind the increased forefoot sole flare?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think it really started with, okay, we know we want to go into this and add stack height. We know we need to add more foam, a foam that is a little bit softer than the previous foam. So if we do that, how can we work with those geometries, those bottom gauges to make sure that overall from heel to toe, it's stable? Even though it's a shoe that's meant to give you kind of a training advantage, we knew that, we'd have definitely a lot more people running in it than say a Hyperion Elite. And so how can we accommodate those people? How can we give them that rocker geometry, but also it feels stable from heel to toe? And so that was definitely a big part of it. One of the other things that we looked at as well is kind of that top midsole line there. And again, it almost kind of creates like another stability point there. It kind of just keeps you locked in on that top zone there. And then obviously medially, you kind of see the same thing as well. So using like geometries, using those top midsole lines holistically, and then obviously kind of flaring that bottom gauge there just to make sure that everything from heel to toe is as stable as we can make it.
Yeah, for me, that's very well designed. Now, you've mentioned a couple times about like this idea of like your two lines emerging, the Energize line and the Cushion line. So does that mean that the shoes like the Levitate are going away or are going to see significant changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Levitate will eventually leave the line. And the goal is, the same way that the people or that the consumers there talked about, like, I want something bouncy, I want something like fun, resilient. All of those people who are in kind of our Hyperion products are saying the same thing. So we're hoping to bring them along, of course. And sometimes when we do that, things don't end up perfectly, but we really feel that Flash V2, like, DNA amp would have evolved in that way anyways. So from a line architecture, like it just holistically makes sense. So yeah, Levitate will lead the line, but our goal is to continue to put a lot of eggs in that Hyperion basket. Like we created a super franchise for a reason. We believe in that name. We believe in the technology we're putting into it. So how can we continue to evolve that better for the masses, but for the person who just kind of wants like a bouncier and more fun ride?
Awesome. So now that leads me into, so what's going to happen in 2025 and beyond? Of course, whatever you're able to talk about at this point.
Yeah. So there's kind of two big stories, I would say. Look for a couple of things to shake out with Hyperion Elite. So not just one thing, a couple of things. And so that's something that we are very excited about. Again, we had this kind of great platform. Hyperion Elite 4 was sold out for a very long time. So we feel like we had a great start with that product. And so when we get to 2025, we feel like we're going to make a couple big moves and we're really excited about that. Both from a foam point of view and then a geometry point of view. Like you'll see kind of some very interesting looking shoes from us, which is exciting. I do want to give a nod to the launch. That's a shoe that's been around for 10 years. It has a pretty like cult following. And then during kind of COVID times, because we were looking at, okay, how can we make sure that, we get enough shoes out there? So we kind of stopped evolving some shoes just to make sure that we had enough inventory for everybody from, the rest of the line. So the Launch 11 will update in spring of 2025. That gets supercritical foam at a very friendly price point, which is really hard to do. And so we're really excited about that because that's a nice little like everyday trainer that I would say instead of on the soft side, it definitely has all those responsive properties. So that's a shoe that I'm actually excited about because I think from a price point, to your point, like we're raising prices all the time. Supercritical foam isn't cheap, but if we're able to do it in a package like under 140, we're targeting 120. It's actually like a really friendly kind of everyday training shoe. So you'll see obviously a Hyperion Max 3. You'll see a Hyperion 3. Those are very wild as well. You might get a sneak peek after we turn off the cameras and we can talk through that a little bit.
Excellent.
But again, that shoe in that category, they just evolve so fast that we want to make sure we keep up with the market landscape and keep up with consumer needs because again, it's not just that underfoot feeling they expect, it's kind of the whole package that is evolving very quickly.
Well, it sounds like next year will be very exciting and I can't wait for a sneak peek shortly. But I want to move on and talk a little more about foams. So this year on the Diora podcast, we've had a couple of guests talk about how it's not all about PIBA-based foams anymore. It's really about the properties that you give to, an EVA or even a TP foam. Specifically, like when we had the Mizuno team on talking about the Neo Vista, and they blew Matt's mind when they told us that the Neo Vista was EVA. So can you talk a little bit about how Brooks manipulates its foams to give them properties like high resilience, to make those shoes high performance shoes from your line?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because to your point, PIBA is a wonderful product, but it has some advantages and it has some disadvantages. So when we were looking at, again, going from Flash V1 to Flash V2 and adding that TPEE property, that TPE, that beaded property kind of adds just like a softness to it, like we kind of talked about before. And so if we were going to make that an everyday trainer, that was a really important kind of part of that tech transfer and that package that we were trying to do there. But the one thing that we were able to get out of it is longevity. So anytime we bring in a shoe that has, that we expect 300 to 500 miles, like the properties that we put into it have to embody that. So that's why, PIBA is such a great product because it's very lightweight and it's very resilient. But as far as the longevity of it, it definitely struggles. And so if we're making shoes in that package from 140 to 180, we want to make sure that the consumer gets the most out of it. So it's, little things that the guys kind of do in the lab that I'm not always privy to. But again, it starts with the tech transfer of like, what does the consumer expect? What do they want out of the properties? How soft can you make it without necessarily bottoming out after 100 miles? Those are things that we kind of sweat the details on for sure.
I wonder if the running shoe market in the future will do a better job of communicating actual data points to consumers, because I think right now people, when they make their shoe buying decisions, are like, okay, does it have a carbon plate? Which we know the plate is really not like the big game changer when it comes to performance. And then second, is it PIBA based? And we know more and more that PIBA, again, isn't like the only foam that can have these high performance qualities. So could it be that companies start reporting more of their resilience data? I mean, do you see any ideas about how shoe companies could help people differentiate between shoes a little bit better in that regard?
That's such a good question. We do have kind of access to our lab data, but we always kind of go back to what the consumer expects from it, because you're right. Like they do go to like, is it PIBA? Does it have a plate? But the majority of people actually would not be satisfied with what those two things do because of just durability and then just kind of a stiffness of a plate. So again, we always kind of go back to what the consumer expects from that product. And most of the time, they still want it to be durable. They still want it to last a long time, especially if you're spending $180. Now, there are shoes that I will only spend $250 on. It'll give me my best advantage and my best like PR. Then great. That's a fantastic thing to have. And we'll give you everything you need to do that. But right now, if you expect a shoe to last, like we got to make sure that we build that into any, responsive properties, softness properties, and everything that kind of makes the shoe great.
Absolutely. And, for us shoe reviewers and you working in the shoe industry, it's easy to focus on like the most expensive product or like the racing shoe. But the reality is the vast majority of runners maybe don't care about having a super shoe. They just want a shoe that's comfortable and is going to last, more than 150 miles. So I think that's a good point that, we have to look at the whole picture, not just, oh, is this the lightest, bounciest, most responsive shoe that I can run my marathon in, but is maybe only going to last 50 miles.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at the way our industry is, we've gone through like growing booms. And right now we're in a growing boom of like, you just see run crews and run clubs popping up everywhere, even more than before. And the diversity of run clubs are bigger than ever before. And so when you look at that, you kind of look at how they segment themselves, what their expectations are. And like I said, a lot of those people now are self-selecting into responsive cushion shoes. And if they self-select into that, they still expect like, this is still maybe my first experience. We assume that a first experience might be a Ghost, but a first experience now might be a Hyperion too. And if that is their first experience in the running world, let's give them, the best advantage we can as far as just foam resiliency. But again, in packages where it fits a little bit better, it kind of holds their foot on the platform. It just kind of gets out of the way. And that gives them the best experience to continue to grow the industry at the rate it's going at.
Yeah, I would agree. I've seen, it feels like there are new or growing run clubs everywhere where I live. And it's very cool to see. And if you look at them, it's not full of, people who are qualifying for Boston. It's just people who love to run. They maybe don't do any races. They just enjoy running and they want to be with other people who enjoy running. So I think it's really important for all of us in like the media and industry to remember that it's not just all about racing shoes.
It's fun to talk about. I mean, again,
it is, yeah.
It's so fun to talk about. But you're right. There is a huge segment of the running industry that they don't even know plates exist. And so we want to make sure we give them the best product, regardless of that. But again, when we talk about new plate iterations, new foams, like it's fun because we know that the industry is progressing and having a lot of fun doing it. And I think that's like how we embody this industry in general, right? Like we go out there, we go for a run, we want to enjoy it, we want to keep doing it. And so like we're trying to build in fun through technology, but someone just wants fun, as just part of their everyday experience. So
absolutely. Yeah. So let's move on from the Hyperion line and let's talk about the Ghost Max, because that was quite a shoe for you guys last year, wasn't it? It set some records, I think, for Brooks. Like you sold a lot of Ghost Maxes, right?
We did.
Yeah.
We did.
And, it's all right. So here's Ghost Max 2. So it feels a little different than 1, but definitely same DNA, I'd say. But the thing that was so great about Ghost Max 1, same about 2, it's a very stable neutral shoe, really wide base, works well with orthotics. And it just, because it's stable neutral, doesn't really push people in any one direction. It works really well for a lot of different runners, people with different biomechanics. And it works well for walkers, people who are just on their feet all day. And I think that's part of the reason that it was so successful. And I'm sure you've got lots of data about why it was so successful. So can you tell us a little bit about what you changed in version 2, what people who love version 1 should expect in this one? Because I have not gotten many miles in this, so I would like to hear your update first.
Of course. Well, to your point, Ghost Max 1 had a very good start. I don't think, I think we knew we had something special, but you can never anticipate like how well something does from the jump. So again, very thrilled where Ghost Max 1 started. And because of that, we didn't want to go too crazy with Ghost Max 2. So we wanted to evolve it, but we knew that if like we went kind of too crazy, added, technologies that weren't proven or really evolved it in unnecessary ways, that we might lose the people that we really grabbed a hold of in the first version. So that was the most important thing, is just kind of a slow evolution versus like, let's go as fast as possible. So when we looked at that from a biomechanic point of view, again, business as usual. We wanted to make sure that it had a nice roll from heel to toe. We could lock up that forefoot to kind of give that ease of transition. Very important kind of for that consumer. And so that didn't change. The last didn't change. To your point, like it's one of our most accommodating lasts that we have in the line. So it fits high volume feet, low volume feet, wider feet, orthotics. Those were definitely things that we wanted to carry over an anniversary from 1 to 2. But the biggest update is really going from Loft V2 to Loft V3. And that's kind of your EVA to your supercritical foam now. And so the properties that we found in Loft V3 versus Loft V2 is really just like, it's a little bit softer overall. So when people would go into those shoes, we don't want to just make like a high stack and have it just kind of be firm. So we kind of took that high stack and then we made it just a little bit softer, a little bit more deformation, but then obviously made sure that we locked up the areas that we needed to. I think that was kind of the interesting thing about Ghost Max 1 in general, is we kind of had two consumers. One who kind of felt that it was like a fun new transition, something that was unexpected and they didn't experience, and they found value in that. And then the people who found value in that, it just felt natural. Like that's how their foot naturally moves. They need to kind of lock up their foot in order for it to kind of operate the way that they need to. And so we found that people who were kind of from two different sides actually found that they were loving the feeling of this, even though they were coming from it from different angles.
So I think one of the biggest things that made Ghost Max 1 such a great shoe for a number of people was, one, there weren't many shoes on the market previously designed to take orthotics. And of those shoes, they were all very heavy. So Ghost Max 1 was, I think, at least 2 ounces lighter, maybe even 3 ounces lighter than any of the other shoes on the market that were like stated that they were designed for orthotics. So that's a big deal. People don't want to run in a heavy clunker of a shoe just because you need custom orthotics or need an over-the-counter orthotic. So that, I'm sure that helped you sell a number of shoes. But then 2, Ghost Max 1 was just so well designed as a stable neutral shoe in that it didn't push you in any one direction, but it really did a good job of just keeping your foot centered no matter what like small stability needs you did. So I wish I had more miles on Ghost Max 2 so I could give more comments, but I've been getting miles on Hyperion Max 2 and Hyperion 2 first. Yes, because of your, those two shoes are out now and Ghost Max 2 is not out yet. So we kind of do them in order. But I'm looking forward to testing it out and seeing if the ride is similar to last year's version.
Yeah, I think overall, like if there were kind of 2 ways to sum it up, like just a little bit more comfortable underfoot feeling. And then as far as like durability goes, we kind of took a look at the tread and basically the positioning of the tread and then how much we were using and just making sure it was kind of well positioned to be able to kind of like grip, whether you're walking or running in it, was kind of an important update to that shoe as well.
So can we talk a little bit about stable neutral shoes? And, I'm sure this is more of a question for the R&D team, but how does your team approach stable neutral features? How do you decide just specifically what geometry to use in a given shoe?
Yeah, again, definitely I would lean towards the biomechanic team, but to your point, like it always starts with biomechanics. Whether or not you're a low deviator or a high deviator, you're a former neutral person or a stability person, everybody needs support. And so when we look at the geometries of our shoes, like they should support you whether or not you think you need it. The goal is to keep you on your direct motion path. So as you're running or walking, whatever your body wants to do, we just want to kind of help you do that. And that way your body can absorb shock and stay injury free. And so that's kind of built into every shoe that we do. But obviously, when you look at shoes like the Ghost, has been one of the best shoes kind of for that categorically.
And how has your team changed its approach to stability over the years? We're seeing fewer medial posts, we're seeing more non-traditional stability features. So what is Brooks' overarching philosophy towards stability now as compared to 10 or 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think the biggest change that we saw is like when you would interview, again, consumers, they would say, okay, what do you want out of shoe? I want it to be lightweight, I want it to be supportive, and I want it to be cushioned. Okay, you could say that literally about any shoe in our line. And so how do we digest that and evolve it for them for the best? And so we found that consumers were basically separating themselves by experience. So I want a super soft shoe that is like super squishy. Okay, that's an insight. Or I want a shoe that rebounds really quickly. Okay, that's an insight. Both of those people want support at the end of the day. And so we've looked at kind of our line and how we can evolve it from an experience point of view, knowing that we're always going to build in support no matter what. And support is just keeping you on your motion path and making sure it's biomechanically sound. So I think when you look at consumers, to your point, they would see a rigid structure and that was support to them. They're now starting to realize that they can get in support in brands that they trust. And now they can kind of self-select into the experience that they want out of that support.
Yeah, there are different ways, certainly, to provide support to runners with different biomechanical needs. And I know the Hyperion GTS is one of very few stability, low stack, performance trainers. You could use it as a racing flat. I know Matt and Bach have really enjoyed testing that shoe out. So
yeah, it's a great shoe. It's a category that is kind of difficult to quantify sometimes because there aren't a lot of people that understand that they can kind of self-select into that if they like a shoe that's responsive and they want guide rails or they want obviously something more stable, that there is a shoe out there for them. Because when you look at the competitor landscape, there's just not a lot of opportunities to select into that.
Right.
So we have a little sweet spot there, which is really nice. And we'll see how it evolves in the future, but making sure that we bring in all those consumers and support them equally.
So where do you think, and you kind of alluded to this when I asked you about 2025, and you said there will be some big geometry changes for the Hyperion Elite and Max, but do you think that there will be more changes in geometry in the future, more changes in foam, or is it going to continue to be like a little of both?
Definitely both, for sure. Again, right now as a brand, like we're evolving, I think this like responsive cushion, formerly kind of speed category, we're evolving it super quickly. And so when you look at kind of like tech transfers, a lot of them are going into that product. But I think you'll start to see now consumers being more savvy about what they can expect in more like balanced products. So more like ghosts and glycerins. And so we're going to have to like give them new opportunities to self-select into those as well. So from geometries, from foams, I mean, we're going to throw everything at those shoes. We're still going to give you a shoe that, again, you can rely on, which is Ghost and Glycerin, two of the most reliable shoes in our line. But then how can we open up more consumers to that experience and kind of grow those shoes to allow people to feel something maybe they didn't think they needed, and now they do. And that's what, Max product did. Obviously, when we went into these higher stack shoes, people didn't understand or realize that that was something that was natural to their foot. There are other ways that we can unlock the foot to make it feel more natural that I think aren't being done right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'll be very interesting to see what comes out next year and the years beyond. One last question. So what would you say, if any, the biggest change in your design philosophy at Brooks has been over the past several years?
Yeah, I think as a biomechanic-led company, that was always first and foremost everything that we led with. And consumers really resonated with that because one of the biggest things that they were looking for is to be, pain and injury free. And so we've been great at that for a very long time. Now I think consumers are starting to bring in kind of some of these outside influences into running. And so because running is growing at a crazy rate, you see people coming from, soccer players, coming from boxing, coming from basketball into the running industry and kind of bringing this influence into there. And so you'll start to see what we call kind of our crafted beauty really evolve, like the materials that we pick, the eye stay executions, the tongue executions. Again, that knit tongue is a good example in the Hyperion Max 2 of taking something that's not traditionally just like a lightweight tongue for a responsive cushion product and kind of expanding its uses. So, to give you an example, I met a consumer who was a former boxer, and during the pandemic, his boxing gym shut down, and now he's a competitive runner because he found that love for running. And so whenever he buys product or kind of puts together his outfit, he takes that influence from like his former boxing life and brings it to the running silo. So I think that's kind of cool as running is start to expand. So will materials, logo executions, just the way that we make product from top to bottom will be influenced from like all these different places. So I think that's a really cool spot for us to be in.
Yeah, and very interesting. Well, Tina, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been great. I've certainly learned a lot about some of my favorite shoes, and I hope that our listeners have also learned a lot just about Brooks' design philosophy and where these shoes have come from. Do you have any other closing thoughts for our listeners? Anything else you would like our listeners to know?
No, I think you said you learned a lot today. I learned a lot from you guys. So I want you to know that every time I listen to you guys, like there's always a little nugget I take home. So I just appreciate, you guys doing what you do and having me on and me being a little bit a part of the process. Like I'm very grateful for that.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tina. And to our listeners, thanks for listening. If you have any questions or thoughts, please leave a comment down below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast app, you can send us a message at doctorsofrunning@gmail.com or find us on all the usual social media channels and send us a message there. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Tina.